The other thing that I thought was interesting is that when the former president has his back against the wall, he tends to lash out, and we saw increasing attacks on former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and I think in the lead up to New Hampshire, that's something that we're going to see even more.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi Lim. Now, Naomi, you've been out in the frozen tundra of Iowa.
I can't believe I made it back, honestly.
All in one piece, more or less. Tell us a little bit about some of the things you learned while you were out there for the caucuses.
I think one thing, my biggest takeaway is just the support, the base support behind former President Donald Trump is as strong as ever, if, maybe even stronger than it was in 2016 and 2020, because there's this idea of, standing behind a guy, your guy, that has sort of had everything thrown at him, everything against him. And we saw that sort of play out politically. I mean, he spent half his time in Iowa and half his time in a courtroom. And I sort of spoke to some of his advisors and I asked them, is this something that we're going to expect going forward? Because, the media coverage kind of changed when he was in a courtroom, particularly when he was sort of in federal court, where there's no sort of cameras allowed inside, and there's a little bit more. It's a little bit more subdued. And they sort of shared a photo of what every single media outlet was covering at the time that the former president gave a press conference afterwards, and it was wall-to-wall coverage. So I think that we're expecting to see that. The other thing that they say to justify it is that President Biden, his first speech of 2024, wasn't about inflation or the economy, it was about the importance of democracy, and obviously that coincided with the third anniversary of January 6th. Right. But they sort of said, we're not going to allow, free goals, or I'm not very good at sports analogies, but I think that was something similar. But no free goals. Yeah. But this idea that, if they're going to be attacked for it, they're going to push back. So I think that's something that I learned. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that when the former president has his back against the wall, he tends to lash out, and we saw increasing attacks on former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and I think in the lead up to New Hampshire, that's something that we're going to see even more.
So Haley and DeSantis were obviously top three candidates, but a lot further behind the former president. Did you notice any sort of grassroots enthusiasm for either of them while you were out there?
Well, it's hard to tell when you go to at an event for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, because he has such a powerful super PAC behind him. So it's sort of hard to differentiate who's actually working for his PAC and who's sort of a normal, ordinary Iowan that's potentially thinking of going to the caucus. So that's something that you have to be mindful of when you're going to these events. I think that it was sort of different, because I think we saw a different Ron DeSantis. I think I saw him when he first announced in May, and I went to some of his events, and there were a lot more big rallies, more set pieces, whereas he had to, I think, because of smaller crowds, engage with people more. And so that was interesting, where I kind of came into the Haley campaign where she was rising and under more pressure, and we sort of encountered a more lockdown campaign. While I was there, I went to a couple of her events, and I only saw her answer questions on one occasion. So I think that was kind of interesting. In terms of support, nothing can compare to these people that will wait hours in frigid temperatures to see the former president speak. So I think as much as we, as sort of media critics and Democratic critics can criticize the former president, I think that, there's nothing that they can say that will make his support weaker. Sure.
So as the calendar moves to New Hampshire, Haley is trying to make this a two-person race between herself and the former president.
And that's exactly what, as we're sort of seeing New Hampshire play out, this is, it is, and honestly, a better ground for her. She's more competitive. I think that former President Trump only has an average lead of 13 points. And I say only sort of qualified because that's still a huge margin for her to try and close. The advantage that Nikki Haley has in New Hampshire is this idea of undeclared independent sort of voters. It is basically a pseudo-open primary where people had until sort of last year to sort of change their registration and take part. And we're sort of seeing both Trump and DeSantis take aim at her for sort of being this, Republican in name only, this rhino, and sort of
rhino hunting.
Yeah, like a stalking horse or whatever it is for Democrats there in New Hampshire. And so I think that it'll be more competitive, But I still think that former President Trump is sort of the front runner again, going into New Hampshire and then Nevada and then South Carolina as well.
Yeah, it's the man to beat.
Exactly.
Thank you, Naomi.
You're welcome.
You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.